3 phone calls in 24 hours, before meeting with the Ukrainian president, after meeting with the Ukrainian president, and then again the next day. Each time, Donald Trump on the line with Vladimir Putin, coordinating, discussing, aligning positions. This isn't speculation. These calls are documented, announced publicly, confirmed by both American and Russian sources. What was discussed in those calls reveals everything about who's actually coordinating U.S. policy on Ukraine. And it's not the people you might expect. Let's start with Sunday morning, before the Zelensky meeting. Trump posts on social media at around 10 a.m. I just had a good and very productive telephone call with President Putin of Russia prior to my meeting at 1 p.m. today with President Zelensky of Ukraine. Read that again. Trump announces publicly that he spoke with Putin before meeting Zelensky. Not after. Before. The sequencing matters enormously. In normal diplomatic practice, you consult with allies first. You coordinate positions with partners. You establish a unified front. Then you engage with adversaries from that position of strength. But Trump did the opposite. He spoke with the aggressor before meeting the victim. He coordinated with Moscow before consulting with Kiev, and he announced it publicly, as if this sequence was perfectly normal. The call lasted 2.5 hours. Trump mentioned this during the subsequent press conference. I was on the phone with him for almost, 2.5 hours, Trump said. They're just telling me now. It's a long time. We discussed a lot of things. We didn't talk about the weather. We weren't talking about what a beautiful day it is in Palm Beach, Florida. 2.5 hours. That's not a courtesy call. That's not a brief check-in. That's a substantive policy discussion covering multiple topics in detail. Trump was explicit about this not being small talk. They discussed a lot of things. Real substance, policy positions, frameworks for moving forward. What exactly was discussed? We have clues from multiple sources, and they paint a revealing picture. The Kremlin released a readout of the call. Russian sources are often more forthcoming about these conversations than American ones, which gives us unusual insight. According to Kremlin foreign policy aide Yuri Ushakov, here are the key points from that Sunday morning call. First, Putin and Trump agreed to continue working on Ukrainian settlement within the framework of specially created working groups. The parameters of these working groups would be announced in early January. Second, Trump stated the need to end the war as quickly as possible. This is Trump's consistent position. Speed matters more than the terms of settlement. Third, and this is crucial, Putin and Trump hold broadly similar views that a temporary ceasefire will only prolong the conflict in Ukraine. Read that carefully. Russia is claiming that Trump agrees with Putin's position that a ceasefire would prolong the conflict, that peace talks should focus on permanent settlement rather than temporary cessation of hostilities. This is Russian propaganda talking points. The argument that ceasefires cause war, because if fighting stops temporarily and then resumes, it's worse than just continuing until one side achieves decisive victory. Ukraine has consistently called for ceasefire as a precondition for negotiations. Russia has consistently rejected ceasefires, using exactly this logic that temporary pauses prolong conflict. And according to the Kremlin, Trump now shares Putin's view on this. There's more from the Kremlin readout. Ushakov stated that Trump initiated the call. Not Putin reaching out to Trump. Trump calling Putin. This matters because it shows agency and intent. Trump wanted this conversation before the Zelensky meeting. Sought it out. Made it happen. The parties agreed to talk again by phone about the results of the meeting between Trump and Zelensky. In other words, Trump would report back to Putin after meeting with Zelensky. Think about what that means. The American president agreeing to update the Russian president on discussions with Ukraine's president, as if Putin has a seat at the table, as if Russian input is necessary for American decision-making. The Kremlin readout also included this. It makes sense for Kiev to make decisions on Donbass without delay, taking into account the developing situation on the front lines. This is pressure for Ukraine to concede territory. Russia claims rapid advances on the front lines, claims that are exaggerated or false. But Russia wants Ukraine to accept those claims as reality and cede territory accordingly. And Russia is saying Trump discussed this framing, that Trump listened to Russia's assessment of battlefield dynamics, that Russia's perspective on what Ukraine should concede was part of the conversation. Now we get to the Zelensky meeting itself. 1 p.m. Sunday afternoon, Mar-a-Lago dining room. Trump and Zelensky sit down for discussions, having just spent 2.5 hours coordinating with Putin. The press is briefly allowed in, then ejected with Trump's bizarre comment about food and bribes. Then comes the press conference. And this is where we see how the Putin call influenced what Trump says publicly. Trump characterizes Russian intentions. Russia wants to see Ukraine succeed. President Putin was very generous in his feeling toward Ukraine succeeding, including supplying energy, electricity, and other things at very low prices. These are talking points that could have come directly from that morning's Putin call. Russia as helpful, Russia as generous, Russia as wanting Ukrainian success. Then Trump addresses the ceasefire question. A reporter asks whether Russia agreed to a ceasefire to allow a referendum on territorial issues. Trump's response echoes exactly what the Kremlin said about the morning call. Not a ceasefire. He feels that, look, they're fighting, and to stop, and then if they have to start again, which is a possibility, he doesn't want to be in that position. I understand that position. That's Putin's position, verbatim. And Trump says, I understand that position, as if it's reasonable rather than a talking point designed to justify continued aggression. This isn't coincidence. This is Trump coming out of a 2.5-hour call with Putin and then repeating Putin's framing in a press conference with Zelensky standing right there. But the coordination doesn't end with the press conference. Trump explicitly states during that press conference, I'm also calling President Putin back after the meeting and we'll continue the negotiation. Call number 2, scheduled in advance. Trump reporting back to Putin on how the Zelensky meeting went. This happened Sunday evening. We don't have as detailed a readout of this second call, but we know it occurred because Trump announced it would happen, and Russian sources confirmed it did. The implication is clear. Trump consults with Putin before meeting Zelensky, then reports back to Putin after meeting Zelensky. Putin is being kept in the loop on American discussions with Ukraine in real time. That's not normal diplomatic practice. That's coordination with one party at the expense of another. Then comes Monday. Call number 3. Caroline Leavitt, Trump's spokesperson, announces, President Trump has concluded a positive call with Putin concerning Ukraine. This is Trump's third call with Putin in the past 24 hours. Third call. 24 hours. And this one was described as specifically concerning Ukraine. We have less detail on this call's content, but the pattern is unmistakable. Trump is in constant communication with Putin around the Zelensky visit, before, after, and then again the next day. The frequency and timing tell a story even without knowing every word discussed. This isn't periodic check-ins between heads of state. This is active coordination on a specific policy matter during a specific time window. Let's contrast this with how Trump handled Ukraine coordination. No phone call with European allies before the Zelensky meeting. No consultation with NATO partners. No coordination with other nations providing substantial support to Ukraine. The call was with Putin. The coordination was with Moscow. The position being aligned was Russia's position. Then, during the Zelensky meeting, Trump holds it in a dining room rather than proper diplomatic venue. No U.S. officials greet Zelensky at the airport. The press is ejected. And Trump presents Russian talking points as if they're his own conclusions. The pattern is stark. Coordination with Russia. Distance from Ukraine. Russian framing of the issues. Russian priorities reflected in American positions. Now let's examine what the Kremlin readout tells us about Russian objectives. Russia wants Ukraine to make decisions without delay on territorial concessions. They want speed. They want Ukraine pressured to accept current realities rather than negotiate from strength. Russia opposes ceasefires because ceasefires would freeze current lines and allow Ukraine to rebuild, rearm, and strengthen its position. Russia wants continued pressure while negotiating, not a pause that benefits Ukraine. Russia wants working groups that create process without necessarily producing outcomes favorable to Ukraine. Process can become an end in itself, creating the appearance of negotiation while battlefield dynamics continue. Russia wants the U.S. president viewing Russian intentions as benign, as generous and helpful, rather than as aggressive and threatening. Every one of these Russian objectives is reflected in what Trump said publicly after his Putin calls. The language Trump used, the framing he adopted, the positions he articulated. That's not coincidence. That's the result of those phone calls. There's another element in the Kremlin readout worth examining. Trump spoke of impressive prospects of U.S. economic cooperation with Russia if the conflict in Ukraine ends. Economic incentives, business opportunities, the prospect of deals and trade if Russia gets what it wants in Ukraine. This is classic Trump transactional thinking. And it's exactly what Putin wants to hear, that accommodating Russian demands in Ukraine opens doors to economic benefits. But here's the problem. Those economic benefits flow to Trump's personal interests and those of people in his orbit, not necessarily to American national interests. When Trump talks about impressive prospects for U.S.-Russia economic cooperation, the question becomes, who benefits? American workers and businesses broadly, or specific individuals with particular connections and interests? The Kremlin dangling economic incentives, Trump responding positively to those incentives. Ukraine's sovereignty becoming negotiable in exchange for business opportunities. That's the dynamic these phone calls reveal. Let's address what Trump said about his relationship with Putin. During the press conference, Trump stated, "Don't forget, we went through the Russia hoax together." And he'd call me. I'd call him. I say, "Can you believe the stuff that they're making up?" And it turned out we were right. Trump is describing regular private communications with Putin during the Russia investigation, commiserating about investigations into Russian interference, coordinating messaging about how it was all made up. This is Trump admitting to exactly what the Russia investigation was examining: private coordination with Putin on matters of mutual interest, conducted outside normal channels, with content not disclosed to American officials or the public. And Trump presents this as if it's evidence of innocence rather than evidence of exactly what was being investigated. The pattern extends across years. Private Putin calls that aren't fully disclosed, coordination on messaging, alignment of interests. And now, coordination on Ukraine policy through 3 calls in 24 hours. The response from European officials has been telling. Publicly, most maintain diplomatic language. Privately, conversations with journalists reveal deep concern. One European diplomat described the 3-call pattern as exactly what we feared. Another called it confirmation that U.S. policy is being coordinated with Moscow rather than with allies. European nations have been planning for this scenario, American policy diverging so far from Allied consensus that they need independent capability. The 3 Putin calls accelerate that planning. If America is coordinating Ukraine policy with Russia rather than with NATO partners, European nations need to be able to support Ukraine without American involvement. That means increased European defense coordination, direct European-Ukrainian security arrangements, and reduced dependence on American leadership. The 3 calls aren't just about Ukraine policy. They're accelerating the broader fracturing of Western alliance structure. Let's talk about what wasn't discussed in those calls, based on what we know. No discussion of Russian war crimes. No accountability for attacks on civilian infrastructure. No consequences for the invasion itself. No discussion of NATO concerns. No coordination with European allies. No consultation with Ukraine on what positions Trump should take with Putin. No discussion of American values or principles. No framework based on sovereignty, territorial integrity, or international law. The conversations appear to have been purely transactional. How to end the conflict quickly, what Ukraine should concede, what economic benefits might follow. That's a remarkable departure from how American presidents have typically handled conversations with adversaries. Values and principles aren't just rhetoric. They're supposed to be the foundation of American foreign policy. But in these calls, the foundation seems to be transaction and accommodation. There's a historical parallel worth noting. During the Cold War, private channels between American and Soviet leaders existed. Back-channel communications served important purposes, avoiding miscommunication, managing crises, exploring possibilities for arms control. But those channels operated within a framework where American policy was coordinated with allies, where American positions reflected values and strategic interests, and where the content of sensitive discussions was ultimately disclosed to relevant officials. The Trump-Putin calls appear to operate differently. No clear framework ensuring American interests are protected. No coordination with allies. Limited disclosure of content to American officials who should be involved in Ukraine policy. It's back-channel communication without the safeguards that made Cold War back-channels useful rather than dangerous. The Ukrainian perspective on these calls is particularly important. Ukrainian officials maintain diplomatic language publicly because they can't afford to openly criticize the American president. But the private message to European partners is clear. We cannot rely on the United States while Trump coordinates our future with Russia. This drives Ukrainian strategic planning increasingly toward European partners. Canada's $22.5 billion commitment, UK military support, EU reconstruction funding, these become the pillars of Ukrainian strategy. Not because Ukraine wants to distance from America, but because American reliability has become questionable when the American president spends more time coordinating with Russia than with Ukraine. Let's examine the timing of call number 3 on Monday. This call came after widespread coverage of the Sunday meetings, after diplomatic observers had noted the unusual sequence of Trump calling Putin before meeting Zelensky. After European officials had expressed private concern, Trump could have distanced from Putin at that point, could have emphasized American support for Ukraine, could have clarified that American policy serves American interests, not Russian preferences. Instead, he made a third call to Putin, reinforcing the pattern, doubling down on the coordination. That choice reveals priorities. Maintaining the Trump-Putin channel mattered more than addressing allied concerns. Continuing coordination with Moscow mattered more than reassuring Ukraine. There's a question that keeps emerging in discussions among foreign policy observers. What does Putin have that makes these calls so important to Trump? It's not just about personal rapport, though Trump clearly values his relationship with Putin. It's not just about economic opportunities, though those are repeatedly mentioned. There's something about this relationship that leads Trump to prioritize Putin's input over allies' concerns, to coordinate with Russia before consulting with Ukraine, to adopt Russian framing even when it contradicts American interests. We may not know the full answer to that question. But the pattern of behavior is clear, and it's a pattern that serves Russian objectives far more than American ones. The 3 calls also reveal something about how Trump makes decisions. He's not operating through normal policy channels, not consulting with State Department experts on Russia and Ukraine, not coordinating through the National Security Council process. He's making decisions through direct conversations with Putin, then announcing positions publicly without the policy process that's supposed to inform presidential decisions. That's how you get an American president adopting Russian talking points without understanding their implications. That's how you get policy positions that contradict American strategic interests. The 3 calls weren't just communication, they were policy-making, bypassing the expertise and safeguards that should inform American foreign policy. Let's end with the fundamental question. Who's coordinating American policy on Ukraine? Based on the 3 calls, the answer isn't American diplomats, military leaders, or national security officials. It's not coordination with European allies or consultation with Ukraine. It's Trump on the phone with Putin. 3 times in 24 hours, before, after, and then again. That's who's coordinating American policy. That's whose input shapes American positions. That's whose framing appears in American statements. The implications are staggering. American policy on one of the most significant security challenges in Europe is being coordinated primarily through calls between Trump and Putin, with limited involvement of experts, allies, or the nation whose future hangs in the balance. That's not how American foreign policy is supposed to work. That's not how allied leadership functions. That's not how democracies make decisions about supporting other democracies. But that's what the 3 calls reveal. That's the reality of how American Ukraine policy is being shaped. And here's what makes this even more concerning. These aren't secret calls that were leaked. Trump announced the first one publicly on social media. He mentioned the second one during the press conference. The third was confirmed by his spokesperson. This is being done openly. As if there's nothing unusual about an American president coordinating Ukraine policy primarily with Russia rather than with Ukraine or American allies. The transparency of it suggests Trump genuinely doesn't see a problem with this approach. He views these Putin calls as normal, appropriate, even praiseworthy presidential conduct. That disconnect between what Trump thinks this looks like and what it actually reveals might be the most troubling aspect of all. 3 phone calls, 24 hours, and American policy coordinated primarily with Moscow rather than with allies or experts. The calls tell the story. And it's a story that should concern anyone who cares about American credibility, Allied unity, or Ukrainian sovereignty.